So I hope everyone had a nice evening, good sleep, good dreams. Is there anyone who's here who wasn't here last night? New people, a few? Okay, well, welcome. I'd like to just start with a few minutes of meditation to just try to make sure our mind is in as positive a state as possible. I know you already did some meditation earlier this morning, but it doesn't hurt to do more. It's always good to do. So make sure you're sitting comfortably. Try to be as free of tension as possible. If there is any tension anywhere in your body or in your mind, in your emotions, your thoughts, see if you can let it go. It's not permanent. So let it go. You can imagine that it kind of melts and then flows out of you. You can imagine it draining out of you. Draining out of your body, and then let it sink into the earth beneath us, where it just disappears, vanishes. And then become aware of your breath flowing in and out. Just let the body breathe in a natural way without trying to control it, regulate it, manipulate it. That's not necessary because our body knows how to breathe on its own. It doesn't need to be controlled. And as you breathe, you can imagine any remaining tension there might be in your body or mind going out with the exhalation of the breath. So with each breath, you can become more and more relaxed. And you can also imagine as you're breathing in, you're breathing in good energy. There's so much good energy in this place. From all the positive things that have been going on here for many years, all the positive thoughts and positive actions, prayers, meditations, teachings, so many good things have been happening here. So this place has very, very good energy. And also just the peace and quiet of nature. Far away from cities and traffic and busyness, noise. And just with each breath you can imagine taking in good energy. The good energy of this place, this environment, and of the universe. There's lots of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas around all the time, aware of us, observing us with love and compassion, and complete dedication to our well-being, helping us. So they're there to help us and sending us positive energy all the time. So as you breathe in, imagine breathing in this positive energy. You can imagine it going through all the parts of your body and all the parts of your mind. permeating even the tiny parts of your body, the cells, the molecules, the atoms. So let your whole body, down to the tiniest particles, be saturated with positive energy. And any negative energy goes out with the exhalation of your breath. And don't worry about polluting the environment, polluting the atmosphere. That negative energy can't really harm anybody. Imagine that it just disappears in space. Now let's take a few more moments to reflect on why we're here. We're here because we want to be happy. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with wanting to be happy. We deserve to be happy. We can be happy. We have the ability, the potential to experience not just ordinary happiness, but very profound and vast and pure, long-lasting happiness. The happiness of enlightenment. So that potential, that ability exists within us even right now, even at this moment, at every moment of our life. It's always there. It's always part of us. It cannot be damaged or destroyed in any way. It's our real nature, our true nature. And we just need to get in touch with it, discover it, bring it out, make it manifest, cultivate it. And that's the whole purpose of the Buddha giving teachings, to help us, to help all living beings discover our true nature, to emerge from suffering and dissatisfaction, and to achieve real long-lasting peace and happiness. That as we are here listening and contemplating and meditating on the Buddha's teachings, it's best if we can go beyond our narrow sense of self or self-interest and try to expand our mind, our heart, our awareness, and think about others. And think that we're here not just for our own happiness, but for the happiness of others as well. What we learn here, we can bring into our lives to enrich our lives and share with others, our family, our friends, people we meet, neighbors, colleagues at work, and also the wider community around us, even people we don't necessarily meet or deal with. If we have more positive energy within ourselves, then that can affect others, even far away, even on the other side of the world. So if you're comfortable with that idea, see if you can think that your reason for being here is not only for yourself, but for others as well. You would like to learn things that you can bring into your life to make your life meaningful as much as possible for others, for the world. So, for those who weren't here last night, or who were here last night but maybe were sleepy, I'll just do a quick review of some of the main things we looked at last night. So in general, what we're looking at this weekend is the topic of how to transform suffering, the art of transforming suffering. So last night, just looked a little bit about what suffering is, and actually I want to add more to that, because in Buddhism, some of you are not so familiar with Buddhism, Buddhist ideas, but the Buddhist explanation of suffering, or another way to call that, is just unpleasant, unsatisfying experiences. So the Buddhist explanation of that is probably broader, wider, more inclusive than what most people in the world understand by suffering. So for most people, suffering would be really terrible experiences like sickness and pain and war and starvation and depression and grief and so on. So sort of really heavy, horrible, extreme experiences. But Buddhism includes a lot of other experiences in suffering, which we wouldn't normally consider suffering. I know probably most of you have heard this before, but for newcomers, there's one explanation. There's actually different types of suffering in the Lam Rim, the teachings on the path to enlightenment. They have these different lists of different types of suffering, 6 sufferings, 8 sufferings, and so on and so forth. But there's this one list of 3 types of suffering. And this is said to include all the types of suffering, all the different types of unpleasant experiences that there are, or unsatisfying experiences that there are. And the first of these is called the suffering of suffering. And that includes all the obvious kinds of problems that we have. And nobody needs to tell us this is suffering. We know it instinctively, immediately. We know it. Animals know it. Insects know it. Everybody knows it. So that would be like pain, physical pain, or danger. You know, when there's some sort of threat to your life, to your safety, and so forth. Then that feeling of terror. That's also suffering. So this is something animals and all living beings know. So that's the first type of suffering. Obvious physical pain or mental or emotional pain difficulties. Okay. So that's what most people, most beings in the world recognize. We have no trouble with that. But then there's the second type of suffering, which is called the suffering of change. This one is really difficult to accept and understand, because included in this are experiences that we would normally consider pleasant experiences, happy experiences, nice experiences, but they are temporary or transitory. They don't last. And they're not fully satisfying. So they're just like temporary moments of pleasure that come and go in our lives, and we're not able to hold on to them. We're not able to keep them. So there's sort of rainbow-like, illusory, dream-like experiences of pleasure. So one of the best examples of that is eating. Eating food, which we all like, I think. Most people like to eat food. And we need to eat food. We can't live without it. Our bodies need food. So there's a certain amount of pleasure in eating food, especially if it's our favorite kind of food, flavors that we really like. But how long does that pleasure last? Sometimes we try to make it last longer by eating more. Having a second helping and a third helping and so on. But then that quickly turns into suffering. Then it becomes the first type of suffering, a bloated stomach, and maybe some, if you have a poor digestion, then you may have other kinds of physical suffering. And also some mental suffering. We may feel really heavy and dull and sleepy and unable to focus. If we're trying to concentrate on something, it's difficult to do because of that heaviness in our stomach. So, but even if we don't eat too much, even if we just eat the right amount, if we were able to discipline ourselves and just eat the right amount, still that pleasure of eating doesn't last very long. After a couple of hours, our stomach is empty again and we need to eat again. Yeah. So we just grow up with this. It's just the natural situation of our bodies, the way our bodies work, and we just take it for granted. But the point is that pleasure of eating food is only temporary, transitory. It doesn't last long, and it doesn't fully take away our problems, take away our suffering. So it just gives us a temporary respite, a temporary relief to our suffering, whatever problems we have. Okay. So for that reason, because it's temporary, it's transitory, it's not fully satisfying, the Buddhist view is that it's another kind of suffering rather than real happiness. Because Buddhism does explain the existence, the possibility of so-called real happiness, genuine happiness. And this is happiness, good experiences that last longer, are more satisfying, more fulfilling, and don't sort of let us down afterwards. Now, most people aren't aware of this kind of happiness, because to be able to experience that kind of happiness, you really need to meditate. You can't just get it out of a box or get it or download it from the internet. You have to be willing to look at your mind and work on your mind and develop your mind. So it does take some effort, some internal work, some internal effort, and it also takes time. It's not something you can just get instantly in one weekend or 1 year. So, but gradually over time, by working on your mind, learning how to deal with your mind and transform your mind, you can experience happiness or even bliss. The word bliss is often used. That is, I can't say from experience, but they say it's far greater, far more wonderful than any other pleasure that we normally experience, even sex, even orgasm. So they say that's nothing compared to the bliss that you can experience internally through the practice of meditation. So for example, when you develop calm abiding, or it's single-pointed concentration, being able to keep your mind concentrated on the object of your choice for long periods of time without being sleepy or distracted, just fully concentrated, then that results in physical and mental bliss. Your whole body is filled with bliss, your mind is filled with bliss, and you're able to sustain that experience for long periods of time. And you don't even want to go and eat or go and sleep or do anything else, because you're just so satisfied with what you're experiencing in the moment. So such experiences are possible, are available to us if we're willing to put in the time and energy. But again, it's not easy, so we can't expect, instant bliss. And then there's an even higher kind of bliss that can be experienced through developing wisdom. Because according to Buddhism, just developing concentration alone isn't enough. You can concentrate your mind and you can have this physical and mental bliss for long periods of time, but that's not really enough, because it doesn't remove the deeper causes of suffering within the mind. So according to Buddhism, the real causes of suffering and unhappiness and dissatisfaction and so on and so forth are within ourselves, within our own minds. And they are mainly factors, mental factors, such as attachment or greed, clinging, and anger, hatred, irritation, and also ignorance. That's said to be the main cause of suffering, the root cause of suffering, ignorance. And ignorance here doesn't mean like, you're not educated. you don't know anything. It doesn't mean that. It means a wrong way of seeing things, a mistaken way of seeing everything, including ourself, our own sense of I or me, who I am, what I am, how I exist, and everyone else as well, the way we see other people, other beings, the way we see the world around us, everything. So the way in which everything appears to us and the way in which we grasp at it as existing is wrong. So it's as though we are living in hallucination, living in illusion, living in a dream, but not knowing it, thinking we're awake and we see things as they are and we're right about things, and but according to Buddhism, we're not. We actually have this mistaken way of seeing things. And that's said to be the root cause of all our suffering, all our problems. It's because of that we have all the other problems, dissatisfaction and worry and anxiety and depression and irritation and then all the physical problems as well, including all the global problems like war and so forth. So all of these are rooted in ignorance, not seeing the true nature of things. But it is possible to be free of ignorance. It's not something permanent that we can ever get rid of. We can get rid of it, we can overcome it and be free of it. And the remedy or the antidote to ignorance is wisdom. So wisdom is the exact opposite. It's seeing things as they are, seeing the true nature of things, seeing ourself as we really are, the true nature of our own self, the true nature of others, the true nature of the world and everything in the world. So that's the real meaning of waking up or becoming enlightened, is seeing the true nature of things. And so when we develop the wisdom, that again, it's hard work. It's not something we can do instantly overnight. But by putting effort into learning, thinking about, meditating on the teachings that explain wisdom, we can eventually experience it, have the experience of wisdom. And that's said to bring the greatest bliss of all. Because when we develop wisdom, that's the thing that really eliminates all these factors within our mind that cause us suffering, that make our mind unhappy and undisturbed and unpeaceful and then lead to all the other problems. So when those have been removed, then there's this real experience of bliss, long-lasting, long-term bliss. And the more we develop that wisdom and the more we eliminate the causes of suffering in our mind, the more blissful we become, until finally we reach the culmination of that, which is the real meaning of enlightenment. The real meaning of enlightenment or Buddhahood is when the mind has become totally free of every single factor that is a cause of suffering, all the delusions, the ignorance, the attachment, the greed, and even the imprints, even the little traces of those mistaken states of mind. So when they've been totally eliminated from the mind, mind is totally free of those, and then all the positive aspects of the mind, because the mind doesn't only have these negative aspects, it also has a lot of positive aspects like love and compassion and wisdom and patience and so forth. So that's also part of the path, is cultivating these positive qualities, positive aspects of the mind. So when those have been fully developed to the highest point, the highest degree, so they're like perfect and present all the time, that's the state of enlightenment. And so that state of mind is just like totally blissful and not the tiniest trace of unhappiness or dissatisfaction or any kind of problem. So that's something available, possible for all of us. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are different kinds of happiness, different levels of happiness, and what most people consider to be happiness is, from the Buddhist point of view, not really happiness, but actually just another kind of unsatisfying, imperfect experience, because it doesn't last. It doesn't fully satisfy us. It doesn't fully remove our suffering and our problems. Does that make sense a little bit? And then there's the third kind of suffering, on this list, and that's called pervasive suffering. And that's also rather subtle and difficult to understand. But based on what I just explained, it might be a little easier, because this type of suffering means just our situation, the situation that we are in as unenlightened beings. Our mind is not free from these factors that cause suffering. We're not free of ignorance, we're not free of attachment, clinging, craving, greed. We're not free of anger, hatred, irritation, and so on. All the different disturbing emotions and thoughts in the mind. We're not free from those. They're there. There may be periods of time when they're not sort of popping up and messing up our mind, moments of peace, but those don't last very long, because eventually they come back again. Irritation comes back, unhappiness comes back, dissatisfaction comes back, or we get sick, or stub our toe, or get a thorn in our finger, or whatever. So something always comes along that disturbs us, that makes us unhappy, that makes us suffer. So the meaning of pervasive suffering is that we are in a situation, and it's not so much an external situation, it's more an internal situation. We are in a situation where we are not really free from the causes of suffering. The causes of suffering being these internal factors such as greed, hatred, ignorance, and all the other delusions, and also karma. We have the karma, the imprints of past actions that we did, not virtuous, good actions, but bad actions, and because of the seeds of karma within our mind, that's why we meet with these different problems in our life, sickness and difficult people hurting us, and so on and so forth, and living in a world where there's just so much suffering. So we could just say that this third type of suffering is just being unenlightened, basically. As long as we're not enlightened, not fully enlightened, we still have this pervasive kind of suffering. Although I have to make an exception to that. Nirvana, which is not full enlightenment, nirvana is also free from this third type of suffering. But someone who's attained nirvana but hasn't attained Buddhahood hasn't eliminated all the obscurations in the mind. They still have some traces of those, so then they haven't developed their mind to the highest point possible. But anyway, so those are the three types of suffering. So as I say, Buddhism explains suffering in a much more deep and profound and also vast way than what's normally understood in the world. Okay, it's a difficult topic, and usually it takes time to think about and come to understand, and I'm still struggling it with myself, when I have a nice meal in front of me, I think, wow, this is happiness. This is great. But, it only lasts a little while, so it's not like real happiness compared with the happiness that we can achieve through developing our mind, developing concentration, developing wisdom, and so on and so forth. But, that doesn't mean that the temporary happiness we experience isn't happiness. I mean, it is a kind of happiness, even if it's just temporary. And we do need a certain amount of that happiness because we have to be able to keep going in our practice. Yeah, we don't, we don't have even that kind of happiness, then it's difficult to keep going. So we need a certain amount of happiness and pleasure in our life just to keep our minds up, positive, happy, and enthusiastic about continuing in our practice, continuing in our work to help others, and so on and so forth. But as long as we understand it's not real, it's not permanent, it's not the real thing, it's not the end product, it's not the goal that we're trying to achieve. There is higher kinds of happiness that we can achieve by continuing to practice. So anyway, that's just a little aside about suffering. So we were looking at suffering last night and how it is so according to Buddhism, suffering is an inevitable aspect of our life. As long as we're unenlightened beings, as long as we haven't yet reached enlightenment, we will continue to meet with suffering and problems. And it's important that we learn how to manage, how to deal with the suffering and problems that we meet in life. Because if we don't know how to deal with them wisely and skillfully, as Lama Tsongkhapa pointed out, there are dangers. One danger is that we could generate hostility. In other words, we could get angry. We can get angry and upset, and we might start blaming other people, getting angry at others, or blaming ourselves. So we can get all caught up in anger and blame, and that's not a good state of mind to be in. And it's going in a direction away from the path that we want to follow. And another danger he pointed out is becoming discouraged. So I think there was agreement last night that this is something that we can experience and have probably already experienced, some of us. So this can happen because of having an unrealistic expectation that if we are practicing meditation and following a spiritual path, everything should go well for us. We should just have a wonderful, easy life and smooth, and everyone's nice to us, and everything works just the way we want it to, and so on and so forth. And we don't get sick, and so on. So some people have this idea, that everything should go well if you're following a spiritual path. And I think I've heard, there might even be teachers, certain spiritual teachers, spiritual traditions who talk in this way, who encourage this kind of idea. Yeah. So I think from the Buddhist point of view, it's just not realistic. So it is inevitable, it is unavoidable that even if we're practicing meditation, we're doing the best we can, we're trying to be a good person, trying to do all the good things for ourselves and others and so on, we'll still experience problems. And you just have to look at the life stories of people like the Buddha and Milarepa and Jesus and Dalai Lama and so on, all our contemporary lamas, and see, yeah, they have problems too. Even though they're such good people doing such good things, they still encounter problems. And this is just completely natural from the Buddhist point of view, because as long as we're not enlightened, we still have the factors within our mind that are the cause of suffering. They haven't been completely eliminated, and therefore they can ripen and manifest and produce these problems in our life. So it's only when you reach like nirvana and enlightenment that you're really free from suffering completely. So we need to have that understanding and acceptance. Just come to accept that problems are inevitable. And in fact, that itself is a very helpful tool, helpful method, just to accept the inevitability of suffering, that suffering is part of life. It's part of my life, it's part of other people's lives. Everybody has it. Everybody experiences it. Because what can happen sometimes, I don't remember if I mentioned this last night, is that we can sometimes, when problems happen to us, one of the second arrows we might shoot at ourselves is this kind of thought, oh, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. If I was doing things right, I wouldn't have any problems. And if a problem is happening to me, it must mean I'm doing something wrong. And then we may have thoughts like, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, everyone else is doing really well, I'm the only one who's got problems. So we're making this sort of imaginary and unrealistic comparison of ourselves with others. And thinking other people are doing really well, and I'm the only one who's got these kind of problems. Does that make sense? Does that sound familiar? Something that happens? Yes. And it's not true, for one thing. It's just not true. Everybody has problems. Even people who look like they're happy and successful and doing really well. If we went deeply into their lives and their experiences, we would find that they're having problems too. Maybe they're just hiding them, covering them up, pretending they're not there. But they have problems too. And so it's definitely not the case that we are the only one in the world who has problems. Everybody else has problems as well. So that itself can really give some help, some relief. Just for example, one woman told me that when she attended her very first Buddhist teaching, and the teacher was talking about the Four Noble Truths, she said it was such a relief for her to hear about the first noble truth, suffering, that everybody experiences suffering. Because in her life she'd had a lot of unhappiness, a lot of depression, and in her culture, it was important to always be smiling and, look like you're doing well and, happy and so on. So she was always trying to put on this happy face and hide the unhappiness inside of her mind. And she had this feeling that she was the only one who felt the way that she did. Everybody else was happy, and only she was suffering. So it was such a relief for her to find out other people suffer too. So that itself can really be helpful. Does that make sense? You think so? Yeah. This doesn't mean we should gloat in other people's suffering. We have to be careful about that. Ha ha ha, they're suffering too. No. Don't go down that road. We also need compassion. Compassion means the wish for suffering to not happen to oneself and to others. Okay, so suffering is there, it's a reality. However, we want it to not be there. We want ourselves and others to be free of suffering. So we need to make sure that our awareness of suffering in ourselves and others is accompanied by compassion and not by cruelty. Okay, but if that arises, if that kind of thought or feeling does arise, just be aware of that. That's there, and be compassionate to yourself. Be kind to yourself that you do have that kind of thought, because that also exists in other people. And in fact, some people actively bring about the suffering of others. Yeah, so we know that. It happens every day in the world. Some people deliberately do things to cause suffering to others. And I think sometimes it's even done to relieve their own suffering. Somebody told me once about their mother, and their mother was like a really depressed person, really unhappy, depressed person. And she would sometimes deliberately do things to make her family members unhappy as well, to bring them down to her level. She just couldn't bear seeing them happy when she was so unhappy herself. So she would deliberately make them unhappy, and that would give her a certain amount of, I don't know, happiness. Is that happiness? Or maybe relief? But that's kind of sick, isn't it? That's not healthy. So anyway, that type of mind, that type of attitude, that type of mental state does exist. It exists in other people, and it might exist in ourselves as well. So if it's there, just identify it, notice it, acknowledge it, but also recognize that that is not the way to be really happy. You don't find happiness by making other people suffer. You might get a little bit of pleasure out of that, but it's not long-term happiness, it's not real happiness. Sooner or later it's just going to turn into suffering. So just notice it, identify it, and whatever happens in our mind, this is so important to understand. Whatever happens in our mind, whatever kind of thought, whatever kind of feeling, whatever kind of emotion in our mind, even the most horrible, horrendous, ugly, revolting, disgusting things that come up in our mind are only states of mind. And as I was saying last night, the mind is something non-physical. It's not a physical thing. It's not a part of our body. It's not a part of our brain. It's just this non-physical kind of energy of knowing, of awareness. And whatever exists in our mind is transitory, impermanent, like a cloud in the sky. It comes, it goes. It's not permanent. It's not always there. That's so helpful to understand. So even if you see this horrible, disgusting, terrifying thought or feeling or image in your mind, if you can remind yourself it's there, but it's not going to be there forever. It's transitory. It's just a cloud in the sky. It comes, we wonder, where did that come from? Why did that come up in my mind? I don't want to think that way. I don't know. For me, it's really helpful to, I don't have too much trouble with believing in reincarnation. I know a lot of people in the West have trouble with that, but somehow for me, I'm comfortable with that idea. So according to Buddhism, we've had many lives before this one, and we've had many different kinds of experience in our past lives, all kinds of experiences, good ones, but also bad ones. The Lamas say, we have done everything. There's nothing we haven't already done. So that means we've done every possible kind of horrendous crime that there could be. We don't like to think that way, but I mean, it took me a while to accept that, but I accept that. I accept that I have done awful things in my past lives, and I don't feel good about that, but I can accept it. And I think it's because of having done awful things in the past lives, or maybe even in this life, those leave imprints. Those leave little seeds, footprints, you might say, in our mind, for the same kind of thought to arise again. I mean, you can see that even now. Once you do something once, then it's easy to have the impulse to do it again, and again, and again, and again. Yeah? And if you follow that impulse and you keep doing that thing again and again and again, then it just becomes a habit. It's just like self-perpetuating, and sometimes then it's really hard to stop. So for me, that's really helpful to understand. I've done bad things in past lives, and so there are these imprints in my mind to do bad things again in this lifetime. So it's just the cause and effect. Okay, I did some, and even to say I did it is questionable, because if it was a past life, that means it was somebody else, not me, not the person I am in this lifetime. Now I'm a Buddhist nun, but in a past life, maybe I was a gangster, mafia. It's possible. Godfather. So I committed murders and all kinds of awful things. But that was like somebody else, not me. And I have inherited the mind of that person with all its imprints. So if I think in that way, then it's like understandable. Okay, I can understand why that kind of thought would come up, but I don't have to identify with that. I don't have to own that. I don't have to think that's me. That's how I am. Okay, it's just a leftover, a remnant from some previous person who I have inherited the mind from. We just happen to share the same mind. So thinking in that way makes it easier and less terrifying, to accept those kind of thoughts in the mind. And then also the idea of impermanence, that it's like a cloud in the sky. It's not permanent. And you can see that for yourself. Thoughts come and go. They come and they're there for a moment or two, and then they go. They're not there always, all the time. So reminding myself of that is also really helpful. And also just to think about the nature of the mind itself, that it's not physical, it's not something, material and physical, which means it can't hurt us. Even the most horrible thought in our mind, what can it do? Can it harm us? Does it have a bomb and it can blow us up? Does it have weapons? It can chop us to pieces? No. Yeah? Just like a dream, when we are asleep and dreaming, sometimes we have really awful dreams. And then we wake up and, at first we're really scared. And then we realize, oh, that was just a dream. Look around and whatever we were dreaming about isn't there anymore. So we're able to just let it go. It was just a dream. It wasn't true. It wasn't real. So it's similar with the stuff that happens in our mind in the daytime as well. It's just in the mind. It's not true. It's not real. It can't really harm us. That makes sense? So for me, these kind of ideas are helpful when it comes to the really ugly or scary things that can come up in our mind sometimes. They're just factors in our mind. They're not permanent. They're not me. They're not who I am. They're just remnants of the past, leftovers from the past. And I don't have to buy into them. I don't have to believe in them. That's so important to understand as well. We have a choice. We have a choice about what we do with the stuff in our mind. We can believe it, follow it, become like a slave of it, do whatever it tells us to do. But we can also say, no. No. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to follow that. So that's so important to realize. We have a choice. Does that make sense? I mean, it took me, it's one thing to hear this, I know, but to actually make it part of your experience may take some time. But for me, that was such an important insight to come to. Now that I am not the contents of my mind. I don't have to buy into, believe in, follow every thought that comes up into my mind. I can say no if I want to. I want to say yes sometimes if my mind tells me to do something nice. But I can also say no if my mind tells me to do something that's not nice. I can say no. I don't want to do that. I don't have to do that. I don't have to believe in that. So, anyway, I don't know, I got kind of carried away with that, but what was I talking about? The mind. Yeah, but also so I think what I was trying to talk about is how we deal with the problems that happen to us in our life. So problems are inevitable. We can't avoid them, but we do have more choice or control over how we respond to problems, what we do when problems happen to us. So that's the main focus of this weekend is we can learn ways of dealing with problems, dealing with suffering, so that that's right. I was talking about that quote from Lama Tsongkhapa where he says that, if we don't know how to deal with suffering and problems, then there are these two dangers. One is that we can generate hostility, anger, and so on, and blame, and so on, or becoming discouraged about our practice and giving up our practice. And this does happen to people. They sometimes have this expectation that everything is going to go really well and they won't have any problems. But then problems come along and they can sometimes feel, oh, this isn't working, meditation doesn't work, Dharma doesn't work, and they may give up. Okay, so that's a real danger, and it's something that does happen, so we need to be careful about that. And so that's why it's so important to understand our mind, what our mind is. So it's just this non-physical kind of energy changing all the time, all these thoughts and emotions and stuff coming up all the time. Understand that, and understand that we can work with our mind. We can change our mind. So there's lots of methods in Buddhism about how to do this, so we'll be going through some of these methods. And also last night I talked about this analogy that was given by the Buddha in a sutra called the Salata Sutra. And he talked about arrows, and meeting with a problem, a bad thing in our life is like being struck with an arrow. Somebody shooting an arrow into us, which is really, really painful. So definitely it is something painful. But then if we don't respond skillfully to this situation, we might, not by choice, but unconsciously, inadvertently, shoot more arrows at ourselves, making our suffering worse rather than better. And this can include things like just reacting with dislike and aversion and getting all upset and angry, blaming others, blaming ourselves, making up all kinds of stories. And this just makes suffering worse rather than better. So there's kind of three things, or three steps in this process. First, there's the actual occurrence, what actually happens. Okay, that's the first arrow. Then the second arrow is our reaction to it. How do we react? How do we respond? And usually our usual response is, I don't want this, I don't like this, oh no, why me? I want this to go away, I want to get rid of it. So we respond with aversion, with dislike, unhappiness, maybe self-pity, maybe fear. There could be also some fear. Maybe this will never go away. Maybe this is my permanent situation. It will be like this forever and ever. So it's really important to observe our mind and try to notice what's going on, because this stuff happens in our mind, and often it's so fast. And if we're not careful, we're not paying attention, these kinds of thoughts and reactions just happen, and pretty soon we find ourselves just in full-blown anger or unhappiness or self-pity or, despair. So that's why mindfulness is so helpful. I think the practice of mindfulness, which is basically working on paying attention to what's happening in our mind moment by moment. I mean, it's hard to do that every single moment, of course, but we learn how to do it. We train to pay attention to our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and just try to notice them. Because if we don't have that awareness, we don't have that mindfulness of what's happening in our mind, like I say, mind just goes on its own steam and just completely gets caught up in some unhappy, negative state. And once that's already happened, once we're already in a state of rage or in a state of depression, it's much harder to deal with it. Whereas if we can be aware of what's happening and try to catch it, try to notice it, and then we can do something about what's happening in our mind. Stop the process, change the direction, then we can avoid a lot of suffering, a lot of additional arrows shooting at ourselves. So mindfulness is super, super important and helpful. And the contemporary practice of mindfulness, as in mindfulness-based stress reduction, I know there's a lot of debate about it, and whether it's a correct presentation, representation of Buddhism or not. But I think it's a really helpful thing. I think it's great that more and more people are learning this practice, or learning to pay attention to their minds. And whether they want to be a Buddhist or not, I don't think is important. At least if they can pay attention to what's happening in their mind and learn that they have a choice. There are choices they can make about what's happening in their mind rather than just following the mind's energy. So I think it's really helpful. So one aspect of the mindfulness practice is non-judgmentalness. That's how it's described, how it's explained, is paying attention to what's happening in your mind in a non-judgmental way. And I think that is so important, because so many people, maybe most people, have this tendency of being judgmental towards themselves, judgmental to themselves, to what's happening in their mind. And again, that's just like another arrow. Okay, so like before I was talking about this tendency to, that something that could arise in us sometimes, this kind of cruelty or gloating in other people's unhappiness, or making other people unhappy, So this is something that might arise in our mind. And that's already, it's already painful enough to have that kind of thing happening. But then if we judge ourselves, and if we think, oh, what a horrible person I am, what a bad person I am, I bet nobody else thinks this way, nobody else feels this way, I'm supposed to be a Buddhist, I'm such a bad Buddhist. So we get into all this kind of self-beating, self-flagellation. Yeah? And maybe not everybody does this, but I think it's very common. Very common for Westerners. Well, Alan Wallace tells a story. Alan Wallace? He's one of the first Americans to start learning Tibetan Buddhism way back in the early 70s, I think. And he was a monk for a while, studying in Dharamsala. And he said, at one point he was with one of his teachers, and his teacher was saying something like, we always find fault with other people. We're always criticizing other people and judging other people, but we don't do that to ourselves. And Alan said, wait a minute, that's not true. I'm always criticizing myself. And the teacher said, no, like, no way, nobody does that. So, so maybe it's not a problem for Tibetans. Maybe they don't do that, but a lot of Western people do. It's a very common problem here. So we have to look out for that. We have to look out for that self-critical, self-judgmental, self-hating aspect of the mind, and realize that that is another second arrow. That is another kind of arrow that we shoot at ourselves and make ourselves suffer unnecessarily, and it's not helpful. It's wrong. I mean, it's a kind of aversion. It's a kind of hatred, which is one of the three poisons, one of the causes of suffering, one of the things we're trying to free ourselves from. So just as it's not nice, not virtuous, not positive to be critical and judgmental towards other people, it's also not nice to do that to ourselves. This is something I have done most of my life, and it was a long time before I even noticed it and recognized it, and still I have trouble with it. So, and I know many people also, many other Westerners who tell me that they have this problem as well. So I was thinking this morning about another example of this kind of process of shooting arrows at ourselves, and just something I've noticed in my experience, that a person might make a comment. They might talk about some kind of fault or some kind of mistake or some bad thing. So it may happen just in a casual conversation, or it may happen during a teaching, or a teacher, Buddhist teacher is talking about some kind of fault. And in my mind, I immediately think, they're talking about me. Yeah, taking it very personally, as if they're shooting an arrow at me, which may not be the case, right? They may be talking about themselves, or somebody else, or just a very general, this is what people do. But there's sometimes this tendency to think they're talking about me. Have you ever noticed that? Has that ever happened to you? Yeah? And then the mind can get into a whole story about, I'm so horrible, I'm so bad, and looking around at other people, they probably don't have this, they're probably not like this, I'm the only one who's like this, and then shame, maybe they notice this about me, wouldn't that be terrible if people saw this about me and they're talking about me behind my back, I have to hide it, I have to, not let people see that. Have you ever seen that in yourself? Just this whole story about how bad I am, how horrible I am, I'm worse than everybody else, and other people don't have it, and so on and so forth. So much suffering that our mind can create, unnecessary suffering, useless suffering, and so much of it is not even true. Like I said, it's quite possible this person was not talking about me. And so right there's a mistake made. And even if they were talking about me, what's wrong with that? One of my teachers once made a comment which I found really, really helpful, so I try to pass it on. He said that, even in cases where we are criticized, like if someone is directing criticism at yourself, of course, nobody likes that. We hate that. That's really, really painful. But he said that actually there's no reason to be unhappy about that. No reason to let that become a cause of suffering. He said instead what we should do is ask ourselves if what they're saying is true or not. Okay? This comment that they're making about me, is it true or is it not true? So there's two possibilities. If it's not true, if you really sincerely examine yourself and you can say with all confidence, that is not true, I'm not like that. Okay? I'm definitely not like that. Then there's no reason, no need to be upset about that, to be unhappy about that. It's like the person is saying you have horns on your head, and you don't. Or you have two noses on your face, and you don't. So it's just ridiculous. It's like nonsense. Okay, they're saying something that's nonsense. So why be upset about that? It's just their own kind of delusion, their own kind of whatever is going on in their mind, and it really has nothing to do with you. So there's no need to be upset about that. On the other hand, if you check, you examine yourself, and you realize, yeah, actually it is true. I am like that. Then if on the spiritual path, we should be concerned about changing ourselves, recognizing faults that we have, mistakes that we make, unwholesome aspects of our character. We should be willing to look at those, examine those, and change them. That's part of the path, changing ourselves, trying to be better, trying to free ourselves from these unwholesome aspects. So, and it's often difficult to see ourselves, honestly, difficult to see our faults. So if somebody else is pointing out a fault in us that we may not recognize ourselves, isn't that a helpful thing? I mean, of course it's painful. It's not nice. But on the other hand, if it's true, and if we really do want to work on ourselves and change ourselves, then we can see that as like helpful advice. Don't worry about the person's motivation. Maybe their motivation wasn't nice, but that's their problem, But we can still see that as something useful for ourselves. And there's this whole idea in Buddhism that the enemy, the difficult person, the person that might hurt us and criticize us and give us a hard time and so on, can be seen as a teacher, can be seen as a very helpful teacher for our spiritual practice, our spiritual development. So that usually takes some time to understand and be able to work with and be able to use, but it's very helpful. So at some time you might be able to even feel grateful to this person for pointing out something that you may not have seen, you may have been blind to in yourself. But becoming aware of that in yourself gives you the opportunity to work on it. Okay, I can work on that, I can improve that, I can change that. So that was actually a helpful thing. So I found that comment very, very helpful. And I think it's also helpful with this problem, which I think many people have, this concern about what other people think about me, what's going on in other people's minds, what people are saying about me. We're so concerned about that, and that can bring so much unhappiness, so much, misery in our life. So, first of all, recognize if that's the case. If you do have that worry and that concern, be kind to yourself, be compassionate to yourself, that is an activity that your mind engages in. Don't beat yourself up about it. But also recognize you can work on that. You don't have to let yourself be so concerned about and obsessed about even what other people think, what other people say. Also, I remember somebody somewhere made this comment that, is it really realistic to think that other people are thinking about you that much? I mean, if we just look at our own minds and what is going on in our own minds, like the number one topic that our own minds are engaged in is me, isn't it? Right? We think a lot about ourselves. How much time do we really spend thinking about other people? And, how they are, and if they're good or they're bad or this. I mean, of course, we do have thoughts about other people, but we don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about, unless it's your partner maybe, or your child or something. But, just people you pass in the street and so on, or casual acquaintances. How much time do we really spend thinking about them, obsessing about them? Probably not that much. So it's probably the same with other people. They're probably not really spending that much time thinking about you, obsessing about you, and, So it's just like we have this worry, this concern about, other people, what they're thinking about me, and what they're, what's going on in their mind about me. But is that really so realistic? Are they really thinking that much about me? And even if they are, how much do they know me? Do they know me? Or are they just looking at a few aspects of me? Do they really know me deep down inside? So that if they are thinking things about me, how accurate is that? You know, it's probably not so accurate. Even if it's your partner, somebody you live with, you know, they probably don't know you that well, deep down inside, everything about you. So any judgment that they make is probably not very accurate. So these are just some thoughts you might contemplate if you do find yourself having this kind of worry or concern about what other people think. And really the most important thing is that we know ourselves. Other people can't really know us. We are the only one who can know ourselves deep down inside. So we are in the position to make accurate, relatively accurate assessments of our good qualities and our bad qualities. So we are the ones who can know ourselves and can know what we need to work on and so on. I have to watch the time here. Okay, so now I'll start talking about some methods, ways that we can work with problems that are more healthy, more satisfying, more beneficial for ourselves and others. So one is mindfulness, which I've already talked about. So sometimes just mindfulness itself, just paying attention in a non-judgmental way as much as possible, trying to have this compassionate, friendly, kind attitude towards yourself and towards what is going on in your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, and so on. Just having that attitude towards yourself, that itself is often very, very helpful, a helpful way of transforming problems. Because with mindfulness, you can sometimes just stop this process of shooting arrows at yourself. Or if the arrows start happening, you can recognize it and say, no, I don't want to do this. This isn't helpful. You know, and just stop it with mindfulness. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? If you just see what's happening, you can say, no, I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to follow that road. And there's a lovely little book I'd like to recommend, if you haven't already encountered it, by Thich Nhat Hanh, called No Mud, No Lotus. It just came out a couple years ago. No Mud, No Lotus, and the subtitle is The Art of Transforming Suffering, which is the title of this weekend. It's a really beautiful little book. And I like, this is the title itself, No Mud, No Lotus. So the lotus is a symbol used in Buddhism for enlightenment, because a lotus will only grow in muddy places, dirty, what we would consider kind of yucky, muddy ponds. So the lotus is rooted in that, and then when it rises up, comes up above the water and opens up, it's this beautiful, pure, unstained flower. So they say that's similar to the enlightened mind or enlightened being. They arise in the world. They're like a Buddha, you know, the Buddha. He was in the world. He was just an ordinary person, ordinary being like us, but he managed to rise above the world and have this totally pure, open, enlightened state of mind. So it's only possible for that to happen in the muddy situation of the world. So the title means if there's no mud, no suffering, no difficulties, no unpleasantness, then there's also no enlightenment. No enlightenment. So instead of seeing suffering as bad and an obstacle, something we want to totally get rid of from right now and never have again, that kind of attitude is unrealistic. It's not going to work. So it's better to accept and acknowledge that there will be suffering, and that the suffering can even help us become enlightened. It helps our lotus of enlightenment grow. So that's the idea of the book, that suffering isn't bad. It all depends on how we will use it, how we work with it, and it can help us and our enlightenment. So in that book, he talks a lot about the importance of accepting suffering, not rejecting it, and not reacting negatively to it. And he even gives this little, what he calls a gata, like a little phrase, a little saying that we can use when suffering happens, relating to our breath. He says, breathing in, I know that I'm suffering. Breathing out, I say hello to my suffering. I find that really sweet. It's not what we normally do. We normally say, go away, get out of here, leave me alone. That's our usual reaction, rather than, hello. Hi, welcome, come in, have a cup of tea. So just that idea can be quite nice, quite helpful. Also, from another tradition, there's this poem you may have encountered because they use it in the Theravada tradition. Have you heard of Rumi, the Sufi master who lived in, 13th, 14th century in Persia? So a lot of his poems have been translated and they're really beautiful. So there's this one poem called The Guest House. So I'll just read it, and if anyone who's interested, maybe we can make copies and put it up somewhere. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So that also speaks of having a welcoming attitude. Yeah, just like somebody who's running a hotel and, welcomes everybody who comes. Well, that's supposed to be, but if it's a gangster, I don't know. But I think it's a beautiful attitude. It's not easy, of course, but beautiful. And he talks about the same idea that, these even dark thoughts and malice and all these awful things that come up into our mind, they can be a cause of learning something, of growing, of something new, some new kind of, he says, a new delight. Okay, so this really ugly and unwanted, painful experience could actually lead to something wonderful, something fantastic. So, I don't know, it's helpful to read these things, inspiring. Let's just do a little bit of meditation on what I've talked about so far and see if we can incorporate some of these ideas. So you might be feeling a bit tired, sleepy, dull. Sitting up straight can help, trying to have a straight back. But that doesn't mean tense or tight. So try to have a straight back, but still relaxed. Let your shoulders relax. And if you are feeling sleepy, it can be helpful to not close your eyes all the way, but rather leave them open a little bit to allow some light to come in. Just have them looking down onto your lap or the floor in front of you. Take a few deep breaths. Breathe in deeply as much as you can. Pause for a moment and let the breath go out. You can let it go out through your mouth if you wish, or your nose, but let it go out slowly, not in a rush. Let it go out slowly and let go of any tension in your body or mind. Let it go out with the breath. then when you wish, when you're ready, just go back to normal breathing, natural breathing. And see if you can bring to mind some problem, preferably something current in your life, so that it's still fresh in your mind and your memory. So it could be something that's happening right now at this moment, or something that's happening in your life around this time, or something that happened recently, but maybe it's over now. You might have many problems, but just choose one. It could be something to do with your health, your body, or something to do with your mind, thoughts, feelings, or relationships, or your work, whatever. Just choose one problem, something you don't feel happy about. You would like not to be there in your life. And just bring that to mind. And try to notice any reactions, like negative reactions your mind may have to this problem. This feeling of, I don't like this, I don't want this, I wish it would go away, it's terrible, it's horrible, it's painful. Wanting it to go away or wanting to escape from it, to avoid it. And if you do have any of those reactions, don't feel bad about it. Don't judge yourself. It's completely normal, completely natural to feel these reactions. Nobody likes suffering. Nobody likes problems. They are painful. Just like the Buddha said, it's like an arrow, being shot with an arrow. And it's an inevitable part of our life. As long as we are ordinary beings, not enlightened beings, we will have these things. And everybody has them. I'm not the only one. Everybody has problems, unwanted experience happening in their lives. So it doesn't mean you're bad or a failure or a loser that you have this. But we do have a choice. We do have control over how we respond, how we react, what we do with this problem. We can learn new ways, better, more skillful ways of dealing with suffering and problems, so that we don't have to suffer so much. And instead we can even use these problems in a beneficial way. Make them part of our spiritual practice, our spiritual growth. But one of the first things we need to do is accept them, accept this suffering, accept this problem. So you could try this little phrase recommended by Thich Nhat Hanh. You can use his words or change the words in whatever way you wish. So his words were, breathing in, I know that I'm suffering. Breathing out, I say hello to my suffering. Just spend a few moments trying to do that and see what happens. And then consider the idea that this unwanted problem, this unpleasant experience, the situation in your life, may not be such a bad thing. It might even be something helpful. You might learn something from this, something that will help you to grow, to become more wise, more compassionate, more happy even. But we do need to have an attitude of acceptance and friendliness rather than hatred and aversion. We have to give this problem a chance to teach us something. So are you willing to do that? Are you willing to accept it in your life and give it a chance to teach you something that will help you, especially if you want to follow this spiritual path? Problems can be very, very helpful, very instructive, very juicy. Do any of you have a question you'd like to ask? Anything that's not clear or yeah.
So you said a couple of times that there were 3 steps. And the first one was the initial pain, and the second one was our unpleasant reaction. So what is the third step?
Yeah, the third step is like mental activity, thoughts, making stories, you know. So like just that example that I mentioned, somebody makes a comment in a teaching or in a conversation. Somebody talks about some fault or whatever. And then the reaction would be, oh, you're talking about me. or some unpleasantness, and then the mind starts to think and make stories. Oh, I'm so terrible, I'm so horrible, nobody else is like this, and so on and so on. That's all the mental activity, the stories that our mind spins, making a whole web of, and it's just making things worse. And a lot of it is probably not even true. Much of it is not true, and yet we tend to just buy into it and believe in it. Yeah. So those are the 3 steps. I actually got this from a book called, forget the name, but the author is Toni Bernhard. Have you come across her books? Her first book is called How to Be Sick. Great title. But really, really nice book. She's talking about her own story, her own experience. She was a law professor at UC Davis in California. And one time she was on a trip, vacation with her husband in Paris, and she got sick. And at first they thought it was just the flu, looked like the flu. But she didn't get better. So she was sick the whole time. She was on this trip to Paris. And even after going home, she would go to doctor after doctor after doctor, and they did test after test, and they just couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. But she never got well. 10 years, 15 years, she just continued to be sick, and it got worse and worse and worse. And eventually, she just had to give up everything, her job, her life, her social life, and she has spent most of her time in bed, being sick, and often in pain as well. So she had already learned Buddhism. She had been to Spirit Rock, I think, for about 10 years. She had been going to retreats and learning meditation and so on. So she had to use what she learned in her meditation to deal with her situation. So that's what the book is about. First book is How to Be Sick. It's just telling her story and how she had to deal with all these difficulties and how she did learn to deal with them with various Buddhist practices. So in that book, and then there were 2 other books, and one of them was called, I forget the title, I'll have to look it up, but it's about chronic pain and illness, and it has a lot more material in it. So in there she talks about these 3 steps. So as an example, one of the things she noticed herself, just her being sick and being bedridden most of the time, and being unhappy about that, led her to thoughts. For example, one of the examples was, she says, I'm ruining my husband's life. She was still married, and she just felt like her situation was a cause of problems for her husband. Actually, he was very loving and very supportive and so on, but this is what she said, I'm ruining my husband's life. So this is just an example of another arrow she was shooting at herself, blaming herself for, not that she had any choice, it wasn't her choice to be sick, but, just how this was affecting others like her husband. And I think it probably wasn't even true. I can't remember the whole story, but this is just an example of a story the mind can invent about the problem, about the situation, which is probably not true, and yet you can think this way and believe in this, and it just increases your suffering, making you have more suffering. Toni, Toni, Bernhard, Bernhard, I think. I'll check it later and let you know if that's not correct. And the books are published by Wisdom Publications.
Thank you so much for your teachings. One of the things you said really resonated with me, which was, if there's no suffering in life, there's also no enlightenment. And one of the things that came to my mind is there's this book that I'm slowly making my way through called Listening to the Heart, Conversations in Engaged Buddhism, and it's written by Kittisaro and Thanisaro. There are these 2 Theravadan monastics that eventually disrobed and married and founded a Dharma center in South Africa. And there's this chapter that's called The Grit That Becomes the Pearl, talking about how a pearl is created from all the grit within the shell or the clam, I suppose, that eventually over time is rubbed smooth into a pearl, and it's only through, in a similar way, we as human beings, the suffering eventually over time, how we approach it can eventually turn us into a pearl. And I find one of the things as we were talking about acceptance here at the end, sort of what I personally encounter, sort of the challenges in accepting suffering, is the acceptance that this is the reality and that it's not how I wanted it to be. And that's where the suffering comes in, because we know there's going to be pain, and especially in things like relationships, we have all these ideas of what it's supposed to look like and what's supposed to eventually happen. And then sort of the reality that sometimes those paths are completely different. And eventually at some point it separates, whether it be through conscious separation or death. And that acceptance is a big part of how I sort of approach that self-imposed suffering, if you will. And so I just really wanted to say thank you for sort of sharing that little pearl there, if you will, because it was very insightful. So thank you.
That's a nice analogy too about the pearl.
Last night you mentioned panic attacks and how sometimes the Dharma might not be a solution.
I didn't say the Dharma, meditation. I said,
okay, meditation.
and this is only what I've heard, that somebody who has that kind of problem, if they try to meditate, sometimes they can be overwhelmed. So I think what I meant was maybe in the beginning, just trying to meditate on their own without any supervision and guidance, it could make the problem worse. But I didn't mean never, ever. You should never meditate, never do the Dharma. So I didn't mean that.
I suffered from panic attacks for many years. And in fact, I had one really bad when I was doing surgery. And it was one of the reasons that I gave up doing surgery. I met the Dharma about 6 years ago, and I discovered that my panic attacks were entirely wrong views and the story that I was telling myself. And the Dharma really helped me to rephrase the story and correct those wrong views. And I can honestly say I have not had another one of those attacks, and they were quite ugly, for the past 6 years. So the Dharma was really, for me, a godsend.
Well, thank you for sharing that. But since because I've never had a panic attack, so I don't know what it's like. But since you've had that, what do you think about this idea that if someone has panic attacks and they just come to a meditation course, for example, and they're meditating on their own,
I think everyone's different. One book that I would recommend, it's a very entertaining book, is 10% Happier, written by Dan Harris, who is a co-anchor on Good Morning America, and he suffered a very visible panic attack while on air, while he was on TV. And he found meditation, and also he discovered that he needed more than just meditation. He needed the compassion aspect of it. So he initially took meditation out of its context, out of Buddhism, and it was helpful, but he found that was not enough, that he needed the Buddhist aspects of meditation, namely the compassion part too. But very, very entertaining book. I would recommend it highly. Thank you.
Good. Did you you had your hand up? Well, okay. How late are we on a time frame? We're supposed to stop. We could.
And we're also, we're used to going over.
Well, let's just say we go till 11, then we stop, because I think, what do you have after that? Meditation. Okay. So we'll go a little bit longer and then we'll have a break.
Yes. I just wanted to thank you for emphasizing compassion. Lama Zopa actually has some verses that, live with compassion, die with compassion, experience suffering with compassion. And I just found that is actually the most powerful teaching for me, because my son died, and I find that, when you say it's impermanent, for me it won't be impermanent. It will be a permanent, constantly changing thing for the rest of my life. But I can experience it with compassion when it arises in me. It changes everything. It really, really changes everything. The suffering, is there, but I'm just my own best friend. And those arrows a long time ago, I can't remember which teacher it was, but they were talking about double negativities. So when something negative happens in your life, like that arrow, and he said, you know what it's like? He said, it's like actually walking down the road and stepping into dog poop and then stepping in it again to punish yourself. He said, it makes no sense. You wouldn't do it. And I just think that is such a great...
It's another analogy, okay? A very graphic one. But just to mention about impermanent, the meaning of impermanent doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go away and never come back. Impermanent, I mean, one aspect of impermanent is what they call subtle impermanence, which means things are changing all the time. Okay, so yeah, a problem might come, it'll go away, it might come back again, but again it will go away. So it doesn't mean it will go away and never come again until you're enlightened. But in the meantime, while we're not enlightened, we'll have problems, but then in between the problems there's good things. So sometimes, this is one thing I found really helpful in the book by Rick Hansen, Buddha's Brain, because he's a brain scientist, a neuroscientist, neuropsychologist, and he says our brain actually has a negative bias. You've probably heard that before. It's just the way our brain works, the way our brain is wired, is that it tends to pay more attention to negative things, to bad things, to problems, to suffering. He says it's like Velcro. I love that analogy. When it comes to negative experiences, it's like Velcro. They really stick to our brain. Positive experiences, it's like Teflon. They just come and go, slide right off. And it's related to our ancestors and how they needed to pay attention to threats, signs of danger, just to survive. So that was one of the factors that enabled our ancestors to survive, and we're here today. So we've inherited that kind of brain that works that way. But we can change it. We can train our minds to pay more attention to the positive things, the good things, and not so focused or obsessed with the negative things. So again, this is something we can do in meditation. Just notice that the negative things come and go. They're not permanent. And in between, there's good things. There's pleasant experiences, beautiful experiences. So anyway, that's just to clarify the meaning of impermanence.
To bring up something else that you said about other, potential thoughts. You walk into a room and two people are whispering and you think that, they're talking about me or something along those lines. I forget who the individual said this, but they said, what someone else thinks of you is none of your concern. And if you make it your concern, you will be miserable for the rest of your life. And so I love that. I wrote it on a little card. I keep it next to my bed. And also the comment with on something that you said, I have anxiety disorder, and it's a mental disorder. It's not going to go away. And one of the things that I went through was a program that focused specifically on the mind and the body. And it was both meditation as well as psychotherapy and psychiatry. So I like that it focused on all three of those aspects. And that actually is what brought me into Buddhism. So
all three aspects, mind, body, and...
the talk therapy, the meditation aspect, as well as the psychiatry aspect. Because some people, unfortunately, the talk therapy is not going to be enough. Some people will require
some medication
in order to calm the anxiety down. And so it was one of those things that I had to accept. And one thing that was told to me was, like you said, everything is impermanent. And one thing that was told to me was, when I'm going through those really intense moments, while it feels like you're just in the crappiest place in the world, right, that just remember, it's not going to feel this way forever. Eventually this is going to go away and you're going to be okay. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to remember that. But it helps.
Impermanence is so helpful. It's relatively simple and obvious. I mean, we can't deny it. It's around us all the time. So you can't really have doubt about impermanence. It's obvious. It's a scientific fact. Emptiness is more challenging. Bodhicitta is more challenging, but impermanence is definitely a fact. So just remembering that everything's impermanent, it's not going to last. That it doesn't mean the problem will go away immediately, but it just helps you to stay more calm. Another thing too, I find really helpful, and this is also from this book, Buddha's Brain, is deep breathing. He says physiologically, breathing deeply, like we did at the beginning of that little meditation, this deep breathing, and it's more the exhalation, long, slow exhalation. It actually changes us physiologically. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is naturally more calming rather than the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, anyway, the fight response. So just doing that kind of breathing for a few times, even once or 2 times or 3 times, that helps so much. Because I had a time when I was reading this book, I was living in Israel a couple of years ago, and sometimes I needed to drive a car. And I hadn't driven for like 15 years, so I was out of touch with driving. And then driving in Israel is particularly stressful. There's so many stressed people, and they're just, very aggressive. So there were a few times when I really thought I was going to have a panic attack. I just felt so scared, and I was at the wheel, so I couldn't kind of stop and meditate. But I tried this deep breathing, just sitting there, breathing deeply and talking to myself. It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Don't worry. And that really helped to calm down and be able to continue driving. So that's another very helpful thing.
As an Israeli, I totally understand about. As an Israeli, I know what you mean about.
You're Israeli.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quite.
You know what it's like.
Weird on the roads.
Everywhere.
They will yell at you. Okay. So.
Okay. One more, maybe, and then we'll stop.
I was thinking about Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Kind of paraphrase him, he said to learn to love problems like we love ice cream. I'm not there yet. I really love ice cream, and I'm not a big fan of suffering, of course. But I also want to say that, what gives me hope and inspiration is the art of transforming problems, right, or suffering, is, people have mastered that, like His Holiness and others who still have problems, but experience them in a completely different way. That's what gives me hope, because, that's what...
Just the presence of such people in the world, their example, their teachings, that's so important, so precious. Okay, we got time for one more. Did you want to say something? Last one. Absolutely last. For now.
So I just want to appreciate what you said about we need a certain kind of or a certain level of happiness to keep going in the path, because I often find myself maybe having a pleasurable experience, or actually seeking some temporary happiness, and coming back to the suffering of change and thinking, oh, I shouldn't like this. And it actually is like another arrow. So in trying to recognize it as suffering, but still be able to enjoy it, so that I can keep progressing and not just get down on myself.
Feel guilty. I'm a bad Buddhist. Actually, I have you heard of Ajahn Brahm? He's a wonderful teacher, English monk in the Theravada tradition. And he himself has done a lot of meditation, and he's also a teacher. You can find his videos on YouTube. He's hilarious. So if you need a good laugh, look for Ajahn Brahm. And I was in a retreat once, trying to do calm abiding practice, and I was listening to some teachings of his. And one of the things he said that I found so helpful was the importance of being happy. He said it's so important to have a happy mind, because the Buddha himself said this: a happier mind will be able to meditate better, be able to concentrate better. And it's so true. If your mind is unhappy and disgruntled and, you can't really concentrate when your mind is happy. But happiness doesn't mean this whoopee kind of, Disneyland kind of happiness. But just contented. So he said, just enjoy when you see something beautiful, a beautiful flower, a beautiful butterfly, beautiful weather, just allow yourself to be happy. But the ideal thing, I think this thing about the second type of suffering is try not to be attached to it and get into clinging and craving and grasping and, I want more and more and more, that kind of thing. But just enjoy what's there right now. Try to do it without attachment. But I found that so helpful. It really helped me in my retreat, my practice. It is so important to have a happy mind. So let's stop there. That's a good place to stop. Have a happy mind.